Some jokes are forgotten in minutes, others become destiny. Beneath the scorching heat of Lumria's twin suns, amid the clang of metal and the stench of burnt coolant, Commander Derek Fry knelt beside the crippled cruiser, tightening the final bolt. Sweat dripped from his brow, soaking the collar of his gray uniform, stained with grease and dust. He wasn't a politician, not a hero, just an engineer, the kind who keeps ships flying while empires argue. As he stood and admired his handiwork, a soft voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, are you a human?" Derek turned and saw a little alien girl watching him with wide, curious violet eyes. Her silver hair shimmered under the hangar lights, and her lavender skin glowed faintly in the artificial air. The translator at her collar rendered her voice into perfect English, soft and melodic. "You shouldn't be in here, kiddo. It's dangerous." "I wanted to see a human ship," she replied. "My father says you build machines differently." Derek chuckled and crouched down to her level, gesturing toward the battered cruiser. "He's right. We build for survival, not for beauty. But this one's got a bit of both." The girl nodded thoughtfully, then with a seriousness only a child could muster, she said, "When I grow up, I want to marry a human man like you." Derek blinked, then laughed warmly. "Just a sweet, harmless joke." "Well, when you grow into a beautiful woman, I promise I'll marry you," he said with a playful grin. Her face lit up like starlight. "My name is Tira. What's yours?" "Commander Derek Fry. At your service, princess." Tira smiled as if engraving the name into her heart. "I'll remember. I promise I'll find you again." Then, like a dream, she vanished through the doors. Derek shook his head with a chuckle. Kids, always dreaming the impossible. What he didn't know was that the universe had just recorded a vow. And 10 years later, she would return, grown, stunning, and ready to claim what was promised. 10 years had passed. And yet, on that morning, something in the air felt unfamiliar. Not wrong, just different, like the pause before thunder or the stillness before a song begins. Commander Derek Fry stood alone on the upper deck of the Lumrian diplomatic outpost, watching the light of twin suns stretch across the polished glass floor. The world outside shimmered in delicate lavender and gold. Holographic displays hovered silently before him, filled with routine maintenance logs and political briefs, things he once cared about, now just noise. He sipped his recycled coffee, more out of habit than need, unaware that this would be the last ordinary morning of his life. Then he felt it, a presence, the soft chime of the docking bay doors, a shift in atmosphere. He turned. She entered without hesitation. Tall, composed, and lit by the halo of morning light. Her gown shimmered with threads of silver, flowing like liquid starlight with every step. Her skin was a soft, otherworldly lavender, smooth as moonlight over calm water, but it was her eyes that stopped him, violet, bright, focused. The kind of gaze that didn't just see, it remembered. She came to a halt a few paces from him. Silence filled the space between them. Then her voice clear, soft, unshakably sure. "You promised you'd marry me when I grew up. I have grown." The world seemed to tilt. For a moment, Derek just stared, unable to speak, caught between disbelief and memory. It couldn't be. But it was. Tira. She had been a child, then curious, sharp, full of impossible dreams. Now she stood before him, transformed, graceful, radiant, impossible to ignore. His voice caught as he whispered, almost to himself, "Tira." She nodded, calm, her lips curled in the faintest smile, not of triumph, but recognition. "I told you I'd find you." He took a breath, slowly. The hum of the outpost faded beneath the sound of her voice, still echoing in his mind. He searched her face for some trace of the little girl he remembered, but found only the gaze of a woman who had crossed years and galaxies without once forgetting a single word he'd said. "I didn't think you'd remember." "I didn't forget," she replied simply. "Where I come from, promises to children are sacred, even the ones made in jest." He looked at her, this time not as a visitor, not as an alien diplomat, but as someone real, present, someone whose presence had weight. "You came all this way for that?" "No," she said, her voice dipping just slightly. "I came to see if the man who made that promise still exists, and if he still believes in what he once said." Then she walked past him, slowly, her fingertips trailing along the hull of the ship, beside them, his ship like one, greeting an old memory. "Still built for function," she said gently, not turning around. "But now I see the beauty in it." Derek didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he realized she hadn't returned to claim a joke. She had returned to claim a bond. And whether he was ready or not, the past had found him. The chamber was unlike any Derek had stood in before. A perfect circle of translucent crystal, alive with light, pulsing softly in harmony with the breath of the planet itself. The air carried a sacred stillness, dense with unspoken weight. Suspended above, the twin suns of Lumria filtered through the dome, casting ever-shifting beams that danced across the floor like silent spirits. Derek stood alone in the center, dwarfed by the architecture and the presence of the 7 Lumrian counselors who encircled Hymeech, seated in thrones carved from ancient biostone, their forms glowing faintly with inner resonance. Eyes unblinking, expressions unreadable. He knew diplomacy. He'd faced hostile negotiations, planetary disputes, even the threat of interstellar war. But this was something deeper, older. He was not here as an officer. He stood as a man who had made a promise and now was being asked to answer for it. A pause. Then High Counselor Theron spoke. His voice was calm, sonorous, the kind that never needed to rise to command the room. "Commander Fry, when you offered your word to a child of our world, did you understand what you were giving?" Derek's voice came low, uncertain. "I didn't expect it would follow me here." A gentle ripple moved through the crystalline walls if the chamber itself responded to truth. Counselor Mira leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft, yet piercing. On Earth, perhaps a promise to a child is forgotten by morning, but here, it takes root. We do not dismiss the innocent declarations of the young. We honor them because they are unclouded by calculation or fear. He looked at Tira then. She stood a few paces behind him. Still, serene. Watching not with expectation, but with quiet clarity. She wasn't pressing him. She was giving him the space to choose. "She was a child," Derek said, his voice more grounded now. "I was trying to be kind. I didn't think. I never thought it would be remembered like this." Counselor Duran, youngest of the council, spoke next, with deliberate measure. "Whether you meant it or not, your words were received. Not only by her, but by those who stood near. It was witnessed. And in our tradition, such vows specially to the young carry the weight of intention." Derek glanced toward the ceiling, as if looking for air. This wasn't politics. This wasn't diplomacy. This was personal. Mira spoke again. "If you refuse, it will not be seen as a rejection of her, but of our customs, our way of trust. The alliance between Earth and Lumria is young, fragile. Words matter more than ever." A silence followed, heavy, waiting. Then, the voice that mattered most. "Tira." She stepped forward, her voice gentle, but unwavering like a thread pulled from a deeper current. "I don't need him to marry me, not because of a promise. I need him to see me as I am now, and choose." Another stillness. Theron's voice followed, low and ceremonial. "There is a path forward, not binding, not forced. A courtship by our custom. 3 lunar cycles. Observed rituals. Time spent. If, at the end, there is no harmony, no resonance, the bond may be dissolved, without dishonor." Derek stood quiet for a long moment. He looked again at her note as the girl from a decade ago, not as the diplomatic complication, but as the woman before him now. Calm, composed, impatient enough to let him decide. "Then, let it begin," he said. "The courtship. I'll honor the tradition and see where it leads." The light in the chamber pulsed once, warm, subtle, as if acknowledging the shift. No applause, no approval. Just the weight of a promise that had, somehow, survived the stars. The rituals began in silence. Not the kind born from awkwardness, but the kind that wrapped itself around you like mist, soft, deliberate, and ancient. They were the oldest customs of Lumria, crafted long before their people met the stars. And now, Derek found himself walking through them. Not as an outsider, but as something slowly becoming part of it. The first ritual was the memory exchange. They stood beneath a crystalline arch in the Garden of Echoes, where the air shimmered like breath held in anticipation. Between them, a neural field pulsed faintly, waiting. No words were allowed, only thoughts, memories, translated into emotion and light. He didn't know what would surface. Then it began. Her childhood unfolded, quiet nights beneath alien constellations, fingers tracing ancient maps by candlelight, the longing in her heart, even as a child, to understand something bigger. The pain of feeling small in a world that expected perfection. And then her return. Not as a girl, but as a promise fulfilled. From him, something deeper emerged. A storm-torn battlefield. Mud, blood, and silence. The weight of loss. The moment he nearly quit. Not the war life, and the memory of someone who once pulled him back. He hadn't meant to share that, but somehow she saw it, and when her hand brushed his, ever so gently, he knew she hadn't judged him for it. She simply understood. The second ritual came beneath the open stars. The alignment of moons. Once every 7 years, Lumria's twin moons cross paths above the sea cliffs. A sacred alignment. A moment to reflect, not in conversation, but in presence. They sat together in the pavilion of stillness, wrapped in ceremonial silk, the cold wind threading between them. The sky above unfolded like a living canvas silver, and blue halos swirling across the clouds. Neither of them moved, neither needed to. In the silence, she turned her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. No smile, no signal. But something passed between them that neither language nor ritual could replicate. By the third ritual, the distance had all but disappeared. They entered the greenhouse of becoming, where bioluminescent roots curled gently beneath the soil. In their joined hands, a single seed attuned to their DNA. If compatibility existed, it would grow. If not, it would remain dormant. They buried it together. Kneeling in the earth, palms pressed flat into the warm soil, they waited. Minutes passed. Then something stirred. A pulse. A thread of light rose from the dirt delicate, glowing with two distinct hues, one golden, one silver. Two frequencies, one rhythm. She looked up at him. It knows. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Because the moment wasn't about confirmation. It was about the quiet undoing of doubt. He stopped seeing a treaty, or an obligation, or even the girl from years ago. He saw her as she truly was. A woman forged by purpose, a mirror of strength and silence. Someone who, without force or expectation, had begun to inhabit the places inside him where no one else had ever been allowed to look. Each ritual wasn't just tradition. It was dismantling something inside him and replacing it with something alive. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what was growing between them. The station had long since gone quiet. Only the faint pulse of systems in standby and the soft shimmer of starlight remained. The observation dome bathed in cold silver, its glass curving high overhead like a cathedral open to the void. Derek entered without a word. She stood at the far edge, facing the stars, her figure wrapped in a translucent shawl that caught the dim light and gave her the air of something not entirely of this world. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew it was him. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the silence speak first. Then, softly, "Couldn't sleep either?" Her voice floated back to him, gentle and without surprise. "Sleep feels too still tonight." He moved closer, standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. Through the dome, stars drifted in silence. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she broke it, not abruptly, but like a tide easing toward the shore. "When I left Lumria, I thought it was just a child's dream I was outgrowing." Her fingers traced an invisible shape on the glass before her. But dreams don't always die. Sometimes they wait. He looked at her then, really looked. The girl from the hangar was gone, and yet, not gone at all. "I made a lot of promises back then," he said, his voice low. "Most were empty. This one was never supposed to matter." She turned slightly, enough for their eyes to meet. Her gaze was steady, soft, but unflinching. "It mattered to me." Silence fell again, but now it felt different, thicker, warmer. She stepped closer and for the first time reached other fingers brushing the back of his hand, not demanding anything, not pushing, just waiting. "I didn't come back to hold you to a vow, Derek," she whispered. "I came back to become a part of it." He didn't answer. Because something inside him, the part that always calculated, negotiated, deflected, had gone still. Not defeated, just quiet. She leaned in, barely a breath away. Their hands found each other like magnets aligning. Their eyes locked, and the world beyond the dome vanished. No words, no pretense, just the sound of two breaths sinking, steady. And in that hush, something deeper stirred. Not fire, not urgency, but gravity gentle, inevitable, and quietly immense. Far above the sleeping world, the celestial relay tower stood like a sacred relic, its spires wrapped in glowing filaments of stardust. Around it, the sky wasn't just dark, it was infinite. A cathedral of constellations that pulsed, breathed, and shimmered in silence. Tira stood barefoot on the ancient metal, her white gown fluttering in the charged air, her skin kissed by the light of distant suns. She didn't move as Derek approachingly turned her head slightly, sensing him before he even spoke. He stopped a few steps away. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The silence between them was alive, warm, and full of gravity. She reached for him, first fingertips grazing his hand with the softness of a thought. He responded without hesitation, taking her hand gently, letting their palms press together, warm and real under the frozen stars. Their eyes met. And in that look, without sound, without time, everything shifted. They leaned in together, breath mingling, foreheads just brushing. Then their lips met. A kiss that unfolded like light across water, slow, unforced, inevitable. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't haste, it was reverence. And as their lips moved in harmony, the tower responded, its old circuits glowing softly, rhythm pulsing in time with their rising heartbeats. He wrapped his arms around her. She leaned in, her fingers trailing along his spine. Wordlessly, they sank to the warm surface of the tower, surrounded by starlight and silence. There was no urgency, no need to speak, only the language of closeness. His jacket became their shelter, the sky became their witness. Each motion between them was deliberate, tender, curious, and complete. They explored each other not with conquest, but with wonder. The way her breath caught when his fingers brushed her ribs, the way his shoulders tensed, then softened under her touch. And still, the tower pulsed, as if the stars themselves had paused to listen. Their bodies moved together like tides, quiet, powerful, connected. As they made love, it wasn't just two forms finding union. It was two souls dissolving distance. Around them, faint streams of light curled upward from the tower's core, shimmers of ancient energy, reacting to their presence, their pulse, their rhythm. Like the structure had waited centuries for this moment of intimacy, and now exhaled in peace. When it was over, they remained in each other's arms, tangled under the stars. Her head rested on his chest, his arm curved protectively around her shoulders. She traced small circles across his skin with her fingers, eyes half closed. And then, in a voice barely louder than breath, "I feel something awakening, something new inside me." He looked down, brows drawn. Not alarmed, just quiet, listening. She took his hand, guided it gently to her abdomen. "I don't know how, but I think I'm carrying your child." Silence returned. But this time, it was deeper. He didn't speak, just held her tight, certain, unwavering. "Then I'll protect both of you," he said. "Always." No more words followed. They lay beneath the constellations, stardust drifting above them like snowflakes that had forgotten how to fall. The ancient tower beneath them pulsed one last time. And far below, unseen, unknown, something else began to stir. The silence broke not with sound, but with lighted, urgent, pulsing across the steel walls of the outpost like a heartbeat gone wrong. Somewhere in orbit, the horizon had gone dark. Not lost, not drifting, sabotaged. The flagship of Earth Lumrian cooperation crippled at its core, propulsion systems overridden, emergency protocols failing to hold. The air crackled with urgency, but deeper still underneath the alarms there was something colder rising. A leak. Not from the engines. From the people. Someone had released Iton image, a moment. Derek and Tira, not in uniform, not under orders. Together, close, unmistakably bound. A gesture too soft. A gaze held too long. Proof. The kind that couldn't be explained away with diplomacy or defense reports. And like blood in still water, the ripples spread fast. Whispers slithered through diplomatic channels. Genetic compromise. Cross-species contamination. Anomaly growing inside her. Behind every official statement was a silent question. What if the child is real? What if that child changes everything? Lumrian council members exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Earth's delegates asked for private clarifications. No one spoke the word abomination, but it hung in the air, unspoken, suspended like ash. Derek could feel it, every nod, suddenly more distant, every protocol check a little too exact. The warmth had gone from the room. The horizon sabotage wasn't the first strike. It was the first excuse. A way in. A justification. The beginning of unraveling what had taken decades to build. Security doubled. Access revoked. Tira's name faded from the official manifest. Not erased. Just quietly omitted. And beneath it all, old voices stirred. The kind that never needed facts, only fear. Voices that had waited. Watched. Prepared. And now, with just enough shadow, they began to move. Not in battlefields or broadcasts, but in boardrooms, in genetic ethics, tribunals, in long-forgotten doctrines buried in cultural law. Because now, it wasn't just about politics. It was about purity. It was about bloodlines. It was about whether one woman's body and one man's promise could unravel the future of two civilizations. And somewhere, far from the outpost, the stars still shimmered. Indifferent, unchanged. But below them, in the hearts of two species, the line had been drawn, and it was thinner than anyone feared. She was there, and then she wasn't. No sound, no struggle, just absence as sharp and sudden, like breath pulled from a quiet room. Her quarters remained untouched, blankets still warm, a half-finished cup by the window. No signs of intrusion, only silence. And a single drone, powered down mid-cycle, its memory core deliberately wiped. Then, the message arrived, unmarked, ancient in script, burned directly into Derek's personal console. The line must not be broken. Purity will endure. Attached, an image. Tyresedated, unmoving, bound in stasis restraints, lit by the sterile glow of underground light. Her lavender skin pale under cold sensors. Across her abdomen, foreign marks, medical, invasive, deliberate. They knew. And they intended to remove what she carried before it ever drew its first breath. Derek didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask permission. He gathered a team, silent, trusted. No insignia, no uniforms, just eyes that understood what was at stake. Their ship, stripped of all identifying signals, slipped into the high dark skies, vanishing into the mountain veil. Coordinates traced to the northern ranges, where snow burned blue under starlight and old war bunkers were buried beneath myth and frost. The signals were faint and irregular power draw, hidden beneath rock and ice. 12 life forms inside, one alone, hers. Tira, alive. Beneath them, the facility pulsed like a mechanical womb, cold, precise, inhuman. No insignia, only silence. The kind of place designed not to be found. Not by accident. Not ever. As the scout vessel touched down, wind screamed across the landing ridge, tearing through Derek's coat like a warning. But he didn't flinch. His gaze locked on the entrance buried in shadow. He could feel her somewhere below the stone, the steel, the ideology. Not a political symbol, not a diplomatic entanglement, just her. The woman who waited 10 years, the child who hadn't yet drawn air, both were his now, and he would bring them home, even if he had to burn the mountain down to do it. The air in the underground chamber was dense, metallic, almost too still, like even sound itself was afraid to linger. Derek moved with silent purpose, slipping past corridors that pulsed with an artificial heartbeat. His breath shallow, his steps soundless, every instinct locked onto one finger. He reached the final door. Beyond reinforced glass, bathed in sterile light, she lay, Tira, strapped to a cold bioplatform, her form barely rising with each breath. Wires draped over her like vines from some mechanical tree. Lights blinked softly around her body, mapping, scanning, calculating. But what stopped him? She was visibly pregnant now. That fragile, curve undeniable, sacred. His pulse spiked, not from fear but fury held barely in check. From the shadows, a voice spoke measured, clinical, devoid of warmth. She carries a fracture, a genetic aberration. Derek turned. The purest leader stood behind the controls of a towering device, pale light pulsing like a heartbeat made of glass and plasma. Our ancestors warned of this, the figure continued. A moment when sentiment overrides species, but I can undo it, purify her, purify us all. His hand hovered over the activation panel. Derek didn't shout, he didn't plead. His voice was low, resonant, final. That child is not a threat. He's the bridge, the answer to everything we failed to become. The purist's eyes narrowed, but his hand froze. The silence thickened 1 second, then till the machine powered down with a sigh of dimming light. Derek moved. Within seconds, he was at her side, releasing the restraints, his hands trembling not from panic, but from the weight of relief. As he lifted her into his arms, the platform hissed beneath them. Her head fell against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Then a whisper, fragile, real. You came. He pulled her closer, cradling her like something both ancient and newborn. Always, he breathed. No more words, just the sound of his heartbeat against hers. In the quiet ruins of broken ideology, he carried her out not as a soldier, not as a commander, but as a man who had just reclaimed the soul he didn't realize he'd lost. And within her, the future stirred. A promise once spoken in jest quietly reshaped the fate of two worlds. Inside Tira's womb, life stirred not just a child, but a bridge between Earth and the stars, between a soldier's solitude and the heart of a girl from a distant world. Derek stood beside her beneath the twilight sky, hand in hand, no words needed. Because from this moment on, words were no longer enough. Once, he laughed and said, "When you grow up, I'll marry you." And then, she returned. Not to remind him, but to prove that a single fleeting vow could become the red thread of destiny. But this story is only the beginning. That child will carry not just bloodlines, but questions neither world is prepared to face. So what happens when a promise becomes a legend? Can love alone hold back the storm rising from those who fear the unknown? If your heart caught on something soft and strange while listening, then maybe this story was already yours. And who knows? The next one might be meant for you. Come back to Alien Chronicles, because the universe still whispers to those willing to listen.